So what happens when you put three of the most brilliant, battle-tested minds in healthcare technology in the same virtual room? You get one of the most energizing, thought-provoking, and frankly essential conversations we've ever had on Reaching Higher. And trust me, I'm not overselling it. I'm Aaron Strout, host of the Reaching Higher podcast, and today's episode is a powerhouse panel. So let's meet our guests. First up, Dr. Amy Abernethy, co-founder of Highlander Health, former Principal Deputy Commissioner of the FDA, and a hematologist-oncologist with over 500 published works to her name. She's been a changemaker everywhere from Flatiron Health to Duke University to Verily, and she is still just getting started. Next, Seema Verma, Executive Vice President and General Manager of Oracle Health and Life Sciences, and former Administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, otherwise known as CMS, where she served on a bipartisan basis and championed her landmark Patients Over Paperwork initiative. She knows where the bodies are buried in American healthcare, and more importantly, how to fix it. And rounding out this all-star lineup, Christopher Kunney, FHIMSS credentialed digital transformation strategist, managing partner at IOTech Consulting, 2024 HIMSS Changemaker Award recipient, and one of Health Tech Magazine's top 30 healthcare IT influencers. Oh, and he has his own podcast, Straight Outta Health IT, so he knows how this works. Together, we are diving deep into AI, health equity, data and interoperability, and what it's actually going to take to fix a system that needs it badly. So let's go. Welcome all, Amy, Christopher, Seema. I am so thrilled to have you here. This is our, I think, second multi-guest podcast episode, and we have three absolute rock stars. And the first thing I want to do is, you all have this sort of commonality of technology and healthcare in your backgrounds. And obviously there's this thing called AI that we hear about, like, if not daily, minute by minute. And so I want to open on that front. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is, we hear a lot about it being the great equalizer in healthcare. And I think there's some claims that can be made there, but we know it will make things faster, cheaper, more personalized. I want to dig in and say, where are we actually seeing it work, and where is there still more hype than substance? So if the three of you, if we could open with that, and Seema, maybe I'll start with you, and then I'll hit Amy and Christopher.
Well, I for one, I'm excited about AI. Just with my background, I've spent a lot of time in government and trying to solve healthcare problems, local level, state level. And this is the first time, and the federal level, but this is the first time where I'm actually enthusiastic, because I feel like there's real solutions. If we think about some of the long-standing problems that we've had with healthcare in terms of cost and quality and access, there are some real opportunities here to solve those problems, right? And we can go into a lot more detail today, but if we even just think about quality, right? We know we have uneven quality, uneven outcomes. So if we think about quality of care, right, if we're able to arm every provider on the front lines with more data, more information, and some recommendations on, these are the preventative services that your patient would benefit from. These are the clinical trials that your patient is eligible for. These are some treatment recommendations when we look at patients that are like this. I mean, just being able to have those tools available for folks on the front lines, or for clinicians, is very important. If we think about access, I mean, it's been very difficult over the last few years, to get a doctor's appointment, whether it's primary care or specialty care. And our providers are spending a lot of time on a lot of manual, burdensome work, a lot of data entry. Now with some of the AI solutions, we think about ambient listening, where it can listen to the doctor-patient interaction, it can generate the note, and then it can actually do all of the coding. The doctor could even come into the office, and AI has summarized the patient's chart. So all of these things collectively together will make our clinicians more productive and better able to address our aging population and the growing demand for healthcare. And then I hope that AI doesn't become just another layer of cost onto the system, but that it actually drives savings, that we're getting rid of a lot of the administrative costs around rev cycle, around prior authorizations, allowing our clinicians to spend more time with patients, but also reducing costs, because we're not spending 25 to 30% of our healthcare dollar just on administrative costs, which is what the number is today.
Yeah, it's a great answer. And one of the things I would like to get into if we have time, and Christopher, maybe we can lean into you, is I think there is a hidden cost to AI that a lot of people are ignoring. You know, there are these things called tokens that we have to pay for. And I know that this is not a technology discussion, but you can't have the AI discussion without talking a little bit about that. So we'll pause on that for a second. Amy, let's hear your thoughts on the better, faster, cheaper, and where is there more hype than substance?
I'm like Seema. I'm excited in the moment, and I've been bullish for a long time. And my my enthusiasm continues to just increase. Although, I think first of all that AI is really strong for very focused, well-defined tasks. It's getting better and better for thornier tasks seemingly every moment. But we really have to be careful about where AI is applied. One of the other things that's interesting to me is the sheer distribution of types of AI, of tasks that can now be accomplished or made better through AI. So we talk about AI helping to curate unstructured data that lives in an electronic health record, or be able to identify fine details in radiology images. AI helping to make the patient journey easier and the whole process of being an individual with an illness like cancer. I really think that there is very practical help that comes from LLMs in helping the everyday person answer general questions that are health related through AI. And yes, there are very clinical issues that need additional support from clinicians, but just seeing the process and the progress we've made there is very remarkable to me. And I live a lot on the clinical research and drug discovery side of the aisle, and certainly have seen remarkable progress in drug discovery. And I think this is going to be a place where we're going to see more capabilities. Practically speaking, though, we have to make sure that the capabilities we have in AI today are directed to where we have confidence in action and output, and that we're carefully stepping through the various use cases without being overhyped.
Yeah, I like that. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about the EHR application with Seema in a second. But Christopher, last but not least, thoughts on this opening topic?
Sure. Well, I guess from my perspective, and I appreciate you framing it around what's going well and versus where's the hype. I would first and foremost say that, we're building a plane and flying it at the same time
Yeah.
when it comes to AI, because it's dramatically changing, and we're finding ways to apply it, and we're also finding some of the gaps that still exist in it. So I'm cautiously optimistic about where we're going with the use of AI. And I do think that, to both of my colleagues here points, we're seeing where it's making huge inroads and positive impact in pockets. But I am concerned about the overall impact from an equity perspective as well too. And I think we have to be ever vigilant around that. As was mentioned before, technologies like a bridge and nuanced stacks and that are helping reduce some of the cognitive workload on the clinicians is amazing to see the impacts there. AI assisted imaging and diagnostic support is helping us make better diagnoses sooner. And then now we're leveraging it for predictive analytics for things like sepsis and readmission risk, early deterioration. Excuse me, early deterioration is again, we're seeing impact in a very positive way. But what I'm starting to hear as I go to the conferences and everyone's talking about AI and how it's going to transform an organization, the first thing I want to get a better understanding is the governance model behind the LLMs that are being used around this technology, understanding the workflow design, understanding the change management strategy. The technology might be solid, but if we don't have good change management processes in place to help our end users fully embrace the use of the technology, it will fail. If we don't have our end users reimagining the way they deliver care or their processes because of the use of AI, it will not fully meet its potential as well. And then finally, if we're not asking how this technology might be causing more harm for underserved communities, especially communities of color and rural communities who might not always be represented, low health literacy communities, they're often the ones that experience the worst when it comes to failures in our healthcare system. And so as we're going down this path, again, I'm cautiously optimistic, but a lot of that will depend on the non-technology components that we have to make sure are still in place, the guardrails that we put in place around data governance, and constantly asking ourselves, who is the technology targeted towards? Is it doing more harm than good? And do we have measures in place to ensure the efficacy and equitable use of the technology going forward?
Yeah, I like two things you said. One, we will dig into the health equity piece and the equitable development. And I like the change management element because I think people forget about that. We keep talking about the technology, the LLMs, but it's changing the people that may actually be the thing that's the most important. So, Amy,
Right.
I do want to get into a level of that. So, you touched on this a little bit, but what does responsible AI development in healthcare actually look like in practice? And if there's an example, who's doing it well right now, in addition to your company, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, for a long time, I've been worried about magical thinking, that this idea that we're just going to flip a switch and everything is going to work in some remarkable new way. And in fact, we've seen magical thinking happen multiple times in healthcare. We thought that if we just adopt electronic health records at scale, suddenly we will have a learning healthcare system to give us all answers every day. And we realized that, in fact, there's a lot of steps and it's much harder than that. Um, as I look across the entire landscape, not just healthcare, we've got great examples of how AI and data and modeling have really brought remarkable change. And I think autonomous vehicles is a really great reminder that you have to do the hard work. You need to map the roads. You need to build the right kinds of cameras. You need to build the right kind of data around the world and be able to then train models, but also train on many, many different edge cases and also keep humans in the loop to try and also make sure as autonomous vehicles and models are being used on roads that people are being kept safe. And then slowly but surely you pull away the humans in the loop to now allow those vehicles to act more autonomously. And as I look at healthcare, I think we've got the opportunity to do some pattern matching from other industries and now think about how do we apply that in healthcare. Similar to what Christopher said, I think there are key aspects to be able to do that responsibly. So, for example, the change management, I think, is a really important one. Also, understanding the data that's used to train models, and then how does that relate to the population that you're going to apply a model now, and what needs to be updated about that model to make sure it works well. And the organizations that I see who are using AI responsibly and making change oftentimes are doing so leveraging rigorous clinical trial or clinical research like models. They're pre-specifying the outcomes of interest. They're thinking about what are we going to intending to do with this model. For example, Christopher mentioned identification of individuals who are likely to deteriorate in the ICU or in the hospital. How are we going to apply it? What do we think are going to be the good outcomes if this model is used? How are we going to understand potential bad outcomes, and how are we going to follow that across time? So organizations who have prospectively defined what does good look like and tested models locally are really, I think, some of the examples that are leading the way in this space.
Well, I love that you reached outside of the industry because I do feel like we can learn a tremendous amount. And, for better or for worse, healthcare has sort of lagged behind some of the other industries and sectors. And so there's a lot that we can learn there. So that autonomous vehicle is a good example. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you,
No,
but
go
I
ahead,
did want
Christopher.
to comment on something Amy said, and to that example around autonomous vehicles. When you think about the number of years and the amount of research and testing that went into the development of autonomous vehicles to get the level of efficacy and trust that we could put them on the road and they could interact with human beings, we're talking about decades,
Yeah.
of research and development that was done. What I'm a little bit concerned about is how quickly, we're bringing AI into the mix of healthcare, and we haven't gone through a lot of rigor in some cases, like we've done in that specific example. So I think sometimes we get intoxicated by the possibility of AI, without thinking about the repercussions of it if we don't do the due diligence and take the time to make sure that we reduce as much as possible any inherent risk in its use just because we want to say we have AI now in this part
Right.
of our care delivery process.
Well, it's part of
We
why I had
shouldn't be
three.
afraid.
No, we
Yeah.
shouldn't. It's part of why I had
Right.
these three really smart people on this podcast talking about it. So maybe we can dial people back a little bit and get them aligned. So thank you for chiming in with that, Christopher.
Mhm.
But Seema, I do want to talk about something that's probably one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle in the healthcare equation over the years, and that is, EHRs. And I know Oracle is betting big on AI-powered next-generation electronic health records, for those that don't know what an EHR is, to reduce the cognitive and administrative burden on clinicians. As someone that's sat in a lot of seats and worn a lot of different hats, what's the honest answer to clinicians who are skeptical that they'll see relief on this front? Because I'm sure it's something you all have thought a lot about.
Sure. And I can understand that physicians are skeptical, right? I think they've been burned by promises around IT in the past, right? And the EHR is a great example of that. There was a lot of promises, but really the EHRs were built for billing systems rather than thinking about the physician's workflow. And I think it actually there was probably a lot of gains, but there were also a lot of harms to providers when we hear about burnout, and a lot of that can be traced back to the experience that they have with their electronic health records. You're taking extraordinarily bright people and having them do data entry and cutting and pasting. So I think the skepticism is fair. However, when they start using some of the AI tools, right, whether it's the ambient listening, I think it's been probably the most broadest use case. They really do see the value in it, and they're excited about it. They feel comfortable with it. It hasn't been a big learning curve. But look, there's a lot that we need to think about in terms of AI, and there's different types of AI, right? I mean, there's things like there's the generative AI, there's agentic AI, right? Is it helping you think? Is it helping you do a task in terms of a note? And obviously, given that it's early days, I can understand that providers are going to be a little bit more reluctant when it comes to clinical decision support, right? That's rather than recommending a code, it's very different than recommending a medication. And I think it's important. We're all going to learn a lot more about AI. I can tell you, from a policy side and regulatory side, going into tech, I've had to learn a lot about the technology. And I do think it's important that when we approach this, right, that not all tools are developed equally, right? And there's a lot of hype, and a lot of things don't really work maybe as planned. So there's a lot of great AI models out there, and the AI models are as good as the data that they're trained on, right? Which is great. But we hear things like, oh, this model was trained on 13 years of historical data. Well, that sounds good, but if you really start thinking about that, it's like, no, we really changed how we're practicing medicine over 13 years. So maybe you're actually building in some biases that were there 13 years ago. So you have to kind of be careful about that. I think that AI has to not only look at historical data or what the model is trained on, but is the AI working across real-time information? So, for example, the AI may make a recommendation about a medication, but there's context, right? So does that person have allergies, and do we have that information available to us? Does their insurance company pay for that medication? And are they able to afford the copay? There's a lot of different pieces to that. So the AI may not really give you a great answer if it doesn't have access to all of the data elements, which is why at Oracle, when we sort of came to healthcare, the thought was we went in with a sort of an all-in approach, right? You can't just solve healthcare with one point solution, which is the EHR, right? You really have to tackle the entire problem. And so across the board, Oracle is working on not just infrastructure as a hyperscaler, right, with data centers and actually investing in the mechanics of AI, but we're also developing applications that have AI built into it. And we're also developing AI platforms that allow you to bring the right data at the right time. And in order for AI to work, right, it's kind of the boring part of it, right? But you really do have to make the investments into the infrastructure so that the AI works appropriately. So I'll give you two examples. One is bolt-on technology, right, which is it just sits on top of what you have. And so it can perform a task. And I think the good example of that is one we've been talking about, it can generate the note. Well, that's all fine and good, but does that bolt-on have access to all of the information? So maybe there's some data that's sitting in laboratory data, or it's a coding rule and it's outside of the bolt-on. So some of the bolt-on solutions, while they may seem great in the moment and they're very good for that one task, they're limited in what they can produce. AI that's embedded into the application has access to all of the data, right? So they can see everything that's inside the EHR. If the application is sitting on an AI platform, which brings data from the entire institution together and can make it available for the AI to work. So let's think about patient goes in and we decide this patient needs surgery. So we have to do the prior authorization, right? The AI can automate that entire process of determining, yes, the prior authorization is needed. It can generate the entire prior authorization. It can even send it to the insurance company and get that adjudicated. But if you just have a bolt-on solution, it can't take it. It can't do the whole piece. Let's say the surgery is approved, or we need to make sure that when we schedule the surgery, do we have the right supplies? Do we have the right staff on board? And in that case, you really need to have information from multiple systems. So it doesn't work well to just tack on a bolt-on solution here, a bolt-on solution there. You really have to think of this as an enterprise, everything working together in a system with all the data being available. And that's when you optimize. If you're not doing it in this way, where you're using bolt-ons, that's when you have hallucinations. That's when you have skepticism of the AI. That's when you have distrust of the AI, because it's actually not working across, doesn't have all the data available to be effective. So I think we're going to learn a lot more about this. And as we become better at understanding how it works, we're going to make better buying decisions. And that should hopefully build trust. In the short term, I would say it's very important to have the human in the loop. This is a tool.
Yep.
It's not replacing humans. And the reason why is the human's going to know, okay, this medication, great, but I don't know if their insurance, is going to approve it. The human's going to know, hey, I don't have all of this information available. So at this point in time, we need humans. We always need humans to oversee the work, right? Instead of doing the work, they're supervising the work. And that's important for where we are today. And I think once we start building those things in, the trust, the understanding of how it's built, the monitoring, making sure the human is in the loop, you're going to build more trust in the entire system and more usage of it. But, from our perspective, we don't think that a lot of the current technology is not geared up to deliver this AI experience. You cannot use old software that was developed in the 1990s and put something, slop it on top and expect it to give you this incredible AI experience. That's not going to happen. And if you're going to, build a whole other parallel system, it becomes very expensive. So there's a lot more to AI, right, than just what is it going to do? It's how is it built? And what type of technology are you starting with? Because a lot of the older technology isn't going to be able to keep up with where AI is going. And if you're trying to run two parallel systems, with old technology and some sort of AI bolt-ons, it's going to be very expensive.
Well, you bring up a good example that just to sort of dig down into that. So any of us that have lived through the world of sort of analog to digital, one of the things we saw early days when everything went web is you had these legacy servers and then you had web servers. So a lot of older companies had a really hard time. I worked at Fidelity Investments at the time. You had a really hard time making that transition because everything had been optimized to pre-digital, right? So I think what you're saying, Seema, is everything's been optimized to pre-AI. And so when you have the bolt-ons, there's not that seamless process, and there's a lot of workarounds that make it suboptimal. So I don't think we've been thinking about that as much. So I appreciate you bringing that very important point to the table. I do want to talk about another thing that's been a little bit of a puzzle to solve, and that's the idea of data and interoperability, right? So I'm sure it's the boon and the sort of bust of a lot of what you all do. And so, we've been talking about this word for at least 20 years, probably more than that. My question to you all, and Christopher, maybe I'll start with you, is are we finally making real progress, or are the same structural and commercial barriers still blocking a truly connected health system?
A very good question, and thanks for teeing that up. I've been in this game 24 plus years. I remember when HL7 was supposed to be the answer, right? And then it was CCDA, and now it's FHIR, which is supposed to solve everything, right? And we still have challenges around sharing data and coming up with one longitudinal record. So, I don't want to sound that I'm completely cynical about it, because I'm not, because we have seen real progress that has occurred. But there's also been and a lot of times it's been driven through the regulatory process. The 21st Century Cures Act and the information blocking rules have created some real teeth. FHIR APIs have been becoming the standard way of now, sharing data. And so I think organizations, and I, applaud my two colleagues here who've been on the government side to help drive a lot of that change. ONC has done, and other groups have done some really meaningful work. I still think, though, you've got institutions, companies, some of the larger ones that control a lion's share of the innovation that happens in healthcare, that are still making it a challenge for innovation to occur and to get access to patient information. And so I'm excited to see organizations like Oracle come on the scene and offer, an alternative solutions to this space as well too, because I think when we have one monolithic system, it stifles innovation and it creates, a monopoly from my perspective. Probably won't win a lot of friends with that, but that's the reality of it. Competition is healthy. Yeah, competition is healthy. And I think open architecture strategy is the right way to go. There are a lot of smart people out there in the garages and in their labs and other places who are building technologies that can truly transform healthcare. But if we don't allow them the opportunity to integrate with these systems, then we miss the possibility of truly transforming healthcare. So, from HL7 to now FHIR has been a huge transformation that has happened. But, it's not the technology in some cases that are causing us to not truly recognize healthcare. It's all these other political and corporate, roadblocks that can prevent true innovation from taking place. So, the structural and commercial barriers are still very much there. I still think the EHR vendors still have financial incentives to keep data inside their walls to some degree. I still think that systems compete for patients versus wanting to share that data amongst a broad community. I still think that there's some absence of even stronger enforcement by our federal and state legislators to hold these institutions more accountable for giving the patient control of their records and creating the ability to consolidate and share records across all parts of the healthcare system that patient has to navigate.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to think about it. Amy, you just spent a lot of time at Verily, which is part of Alphabet, or as people better know, at Google, now at Highlander Health. So I'd love to get your answer to that, and then I'll maybe bolt on the second part that I wanted to do, and you can sort of think about it holistically. So on top of finding what you think about the real progress question, also your work is centered on making real-world data and clinical evidence more useful and accessible. So how far are we from a world where data generated from everyday clinical care can actually substitute for or meaningfully accelerate traditional clinical trials? So you can answer the big picture and that sort of deep dive into the clinical trials piece in sort of one answer, if you're open to it.
Terrific. Well, I'll follow on from what Christopher said about, we have a long way to go in interoperability. And as I look at the interoperability lens, one of the areas of focus for me is around semantic interoperability. Are we sure that as we move data around, we're speaking the same language, that the data points themselves mean the same things when they land in one final data set that we're intending to train models from or make inference or conduct clinical trials? And I believe we are starting to make progress in the semantic interoperability space, but we have a long way to go. And I think semantic interoperability is also a key part of how we make progress in this overarching space of better interfacing research and care, and also making it so that we get to a place someday where we can take data that already exists in our healthcare data ecosystem and leverage that for full evidence generation. So that's the direction that we want to go. But semantic interoperability is going to be a part of that story. So let me kind of then move over to this core question of how do we get to a much more efficient world where rural data and clinical trials are now much more naturally fit into our care delivery system, and we get evidence generated at a much faster clip. You know, it's interesting. If we look at it from the regulatory lens, there has been remarkable progress in updating how we think about real world data, real world evidence, clinical trials, and continuous evaluation of any healthcare intervention all the way across its life cycle. We used to talk about clinical trials in very formalized phases, phase 1, 2, 3, 4. It was, and it still is in many ways, this formulaic process, getting to an answer for a regulatory decision, and the medical product gets into the hands of doctors and patients. But in reality, over the last 20 to 30 years, starting in HIV and cancer, and then really starting to accelerate in rare diseases, COVID, and now pretty much across all diseases, we see a much more seamless process of evidence generation where phase 1 and 2 are blurred. Phase 2 and 3 often now have sort of a distinction with a regulatory approval based on accelerated approval made somewhere in between. And now really phase 3 is becoming phase 4 or post-market and then into continuous evaluation. So what we're seeing is regulatory blurring of evidence generation and now much more of an expectation that we continuously learn about any drug, device, biologic, or any healthcare delivery intervention, including AI interventions all the way through. What's interesting is that now we're in a space where we also can think about how does our underlying data and technical infrastructure and healthcare delivery infrastructure support that in new ways. And let me give you a couple of practical examples. The first, and Christopher sort of started to allude to this, we're starting to get to a place where we can stitch together data coming from many different data sources. So electronic health records, claims, sensor data, like what might come from a watch or a ring factor, or radiology information into longitudinal data stories. And these stories now can be highly curated to get to high quality data sets. The problem is it's not a push button magical thinking activity. It takes a lot of deep dive work. And this goes back to the reality that making all of this progress is going to take a lot of detailed work, responsible work, and time. But we can create longitudinal data sets. Those longitudinal data sets can be used for lots of different things, everything from answering questions about the natural history of disease or patient finding for clinical trials or following patients longitudinally after they've received a gene therapy. And those data sets can also, with the right controls and rigor put in place, now also be used as data sets for phase 2 clinical trials or more complex clinical studies. So we're moving into a place where our healthcare data system is blurring into our evidence generation system, and slowly but surely we're making progress there. We do need several things. We need to continue to work on semantic interoperability and building the capabilities there. And at Highlander Health, we have a number of projects testing how to improve semantic interoperability. We need to work on improving the methodologies and the science. We need increased regulatory familiarity in order to build the muscle. And FDA has been active. And for example, saw last week FDA's real-time clinical trials pilot, which is an example in this space. And we also need healthcare delivery system participation in a way that works for healthcare providers and healthcare institutions and doesn't overburden the healthcare delivery system. So slowly but surely, these mechanics will get worked out. And one of the things we're doing at Highlander Health as both a nonprofit organization and a commercial investment organization is investing in the capabilities to now build the data, build the scientific methods, build the regulatory familiarity, and really start to build towards this space of much faster evidence generation and understanding what works for whom and when.
Well, thank you for the two-part answer and being so thorough on that. And I love your touching on the fact that unless the end users are equipped to use these things and it's a bit of a moot point?
Yeah, I had a comment as well to Amy's feedback, and that was, I don't think it's really always a technology issue. I think we've solved the technology issue. It's a willingness to adopt a different paradigm of the data, how we're going to leverage this data. Most health systems don't want to use data that isn't that's collected outside the four walls of the hospital. And so, but that's important information to understand that patient's journey. And how do you move from saying that data has a high level of efficacy to it and should be a part of that patient's record now, and that clinician using AI and other tools can make a better diagnosis of that patient if that data was made available to them and they were willing to accept it as a source of truth. And I think that's where the process piece comes into play, where we have to also say that, we got to get past this mindset that only the data that comes from the hospital systems is the valid data that can be used to treat that patient.
I think it's a great point. And when I was at CMS, I spent an enormous amount of time on this issue, and it's part of the reason why I went to Oracle. When I think about all of the problems that we have across the American healthcare delivery system, right? A lot of it can be traced back to the data problem, not having the right data at the right time, having too much data, having too little data. And so when my time in government, and we had to think about what are the things that we focus on, we did focus on interoperability because I thought that solving that problem would solve a lot of downstream problems. Now we're in the era of AI. If we think that AI is going to work without interoperability, it won't, because you're going to be delivering half of the data, and the models and AI is only as good as what it's served up. So if it doesn't have the data, so there's this imperative that we've never had before. And we're also getting to, I would say, a tipping point in healthcare, right? Where you're seeing a little bit pushback in Washington, where we're not expanding programs, we're not adding new benefits, new populations. We're actually pushing back on the health system. And, whether it's the efforts on waste, fraud, and abuse and some of the changes to Medicaid, there's sort of a point where I think Washington is pushing back on the healthcare system. So there's downward pressure on rates for providers, for payers. Everybody's going to feel that. And so we have to be more efficient. And adopting AI will help us. It will definitely give us some gains that we haven't had before, but none of that's going to work unless you have interoperability. I completely agree. This is not a technical problem, right? You can move money all over the world by just going, to your bank's little station. You do all of that. Like, there's no reason. And even the concept of, we're not using the same standards, the technology can read all of it. It can take it in a fire standard. It can take it through CCDA. It can take it to all of it, right? I mean, the technology is so advanced that we can actually do that translation. So the technology isn't the problem. The problem is the willing, Christopher, in terms of what you said. People have to be willing to do this. We can't think that the data belongs to us, right? The only person that the data belongs to is the patient. It doesn't belong to a health system. It doesn't belong to a pharma company. And that's the only way for us to really take the next step, is to have that, collective dissonance that we're going to make a change when it comes to how we think about data. But at this point, there's no technological barrier. It is just folks thinking that the data belongs to them. And that thinking is what is keeping the delivery system back. It is thwarting innovation. If we can unleash our data, we're going to see a lot more innovation when it comes to drug discovery. We can go faster. And then to Amy's point, right, in our view, clinical trials should never end. We should always be generating data around medications and therapies and devices. And we can do that with interoperability. If we have a patient's longitudinal health record, right, we treat them, they're in a clinical trial, we can track them for years. And with AI, those things are more of a reality. So the technology exists. We just all have to be willing to do it. And I think the government has come a long way. We think about where we were 5 years ago. We didn't have patient portals. There is movement of data. We still do a lot more faxing than I would like, but We are still seeing that it has gotten remarkably better because it's possible. Systems in and themselves can be interoperable. But what we're seeing is even with some EHRs, right? It's the same EHR, but they can't transmit information. It's a choice. It's not a technological barrier.
That's right.
So I was going to ask you a little more about the single patient record. I think you mainly answered that question from a broad brushstroke perspective, Seema, but if there's anything else that you wanted to talk about getting in the way of this North Star from a political, technical, or commercial perspective, did you want to touch on that piece as well?
I think that most people are on board with the idea of a single patient record, but appreciate what Amy and Christopher said. I think our concept of what constitutes the record is broader than what happens in the clinical setting. There's hospital care, obviously, inpatient, outpatient, specialty, laboratory, but we're talking about digital devices, we're talking about lifestyle, we're talking about social determinants, and all of that can be aggregated to give us a better view of the patient. And I think having more complete data gives us the opportunity to deliver better care and to improve outcomes. So we have to almost kind of rethink about what that record is. It's not, the concept of an electronic health record isn't just what happens in the settings, it's all of those things around it. And again, it's not a technological barrier to create that, to say, okay, this is the stuff that's coming in from the digital piece. This is what occurred inside our healthcare institution. So those things also are not hard to do, and you can kind of make clear where the source of the data is, and what data you want to make your decisions on. So again, this is all just a matter of the willing, but I'm hoping that we are at a point now where there's going to be such a demand for efficiency that the system finally says, we're going to stop. We're going to stop blocking data, and we're going to come together and work on this problem.
Yeah, we'll hope that for anyone that remembers Steve Jobs sort of stepping in and solving the MP3 music, the interoperability, that obviously was a lot less important than healthcare, but maybe we will have a white knight. Maybe that's Oracle, Seema in this case. Christopher, up front, we did talk about health equity, and I think this is a critically important one, especially as it relates to AI, as in any technology in the healthcare space. So I know you've long argued that digital transformation, if done carelessly, can actually widen the healthcare equity gap. And you mentioned this as we were talking when we were doing our opening statements. Amy and Seema, do you agree? And what are each of you doing to make sure that technology your work touches doesn't leave vulnerable populations further behind? And then we'll loop back to you, Christopher, if that's okay.
Sure.
Amy, do you want to go first? Amy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I absolutely agree that careless implementation is going to get us into trouble. I think one of the things you've heard throughout my answers is that we have to dig deep and do the hard work to figure out how to have the outcomes that we're looking for. So at Highlander Health, we have a number of projects that we've funded, mostly on our nonprofit side, but also in our commercial companies, really focused on how do we make sure that equitable outcomes are achieved. And, very practically, as an example, we're working with hospitals to try and understand how can data that exists in hospitals' data systems, so that's EHR, but other databases like the echocardiography database, be used to populate coverage of evidence development requirements. Why is that important? Well, all hospitals have to participate, and less resourced hospitals who have to have an electronic health record in place, these hospitals also need to be able to much more easily complete their coverage with evidence development requirements. So how can we make it so that all hospitals can much more easily take care of patients in sometimes very burdensome programs? Similarly, we're looking at how do we improve scientific methods so that our scientific methods, such as causal inference, can be used to be able to understand how medical products perform for all individual patients. So really, we have to dig deep in doing the individual projects to understand how do we make sure we get the outcomes that we want.
Seema, how about you?
Yeah, I think I agree with Amy. A few things. When we think about the quality of the AI, this is where it does become really important to think about how these models are trained, how they're operating, how they're monitored, right? I mean, I think, I was talking to some health systems and they said, we're going to look at these AI models, and they wanted to look at them every 6 months. And what they found is that wasn't good enough. You really needed to look at drift. It needed to be looked at more frequently. So I think we have to kind of make sure that the AI is working in the way that we want it to with the appropriate outcomes. So there's got to be kind of a back end responsible AI system governance to make sure that it goes well. I think the other thing to think about is the individual themselves, is that individuals are using AI, right? People are using AI. It's not just our physicians. We talk about, today we've kind of spent talking about all the new technology that providers are using for sepsis detection, for note generation. But, a lot of people, the majority, if you ask in a room, how many of you have used ChatGPT or another AI tool to ask questions about your health? That's actually a really high number. People are turning there just like they do to Google and a lot of different types of social media, that there's a lot of use of AI there. And I think going forward, we're going to have to think about that, right? Because I don't think providers are used to that. I mean, sure, they're used to, at this point, seeing their patient will come in and say, oh, I saw this medication on TV. They've got to answer that. Now you've got an experience that's happening outside the healthcare system where it's AI generated. AI is giving them a lot of advice, and they've got to be prepared for that, right? So it's sort of like practicing medicine in the era of AI. It's not just about your tools, but it's an understanding that your patient is getting all kinds of information outside of the interaction that you have, and they're going to be questioning your decisions. They're going to be bringing in ideas, and that's just something that we need to prepare for.
Yeah, especially some of these LLMs are connecting to health records, right? So you do have more of that personalized care, but it can go awry. So, Christopher, anything you want to say to bring us home on the health equity front and the danger here?
Sure. Equitable healthcare from the perspective of the patient is built on a foundation of trust. At the end of the day, in the U.S. healthcare system, we have had historically a level of mistrust in our system, especially with Black and brown and underserved communities, from things like the Tuskegee experiments to Henrietta Latt to forced sterilization of Latin Americans. We have a history that has not always treated every community fairly or equitably. And so these technologies, as we stated before, we have to make sure that they do not continue to, perpetuate these challenges and issues that we have had in our system. And there has to be transparency built into the design of these technologies. It can't just go into a black box and say, well, and it comes out and it says all Black people, all brown people are going to have this kind of outcome versus another group. There has to be some scientific evidence that can be validated, that is implemented into these systems, that show that if there are disparities or differences, it's based on scientific evidence. And so, the challenge I think we have today is making sure, and I think Seema mentioned the drift that still exists in these technologies. We have to be very vigilant as we continue to adopt these and decide that these technologies will also start making decisions autonomously on the behalf of clinicians, that we have these checks and balances in place. I just recently finished the manuscript of my first book. It's called Diagnosing Distrust, why people of color don't trust the U.S. healthcare system, and the promise of what I call health equity as its cure. And I firmly believe that AI is a platform that can help to build trust in communities, because it does to some degree operate without bias if given the right information. It can hold us as individuals, as human beings, accountable too, based on the decisions that we make, if we design it in a way that is inclusive of the populations that we serve, and that we have transparency in how it's making its decisions and how it's creating insights as well too. So my only comment going forward is that the adoption of any of these technologies, whether it's a wearable device that you're expecting my grandmother to wear on her arm, or your grandmother or mother, they're going to want to know and believe and trust that the information is collecting it's accurate, and it has a high level of equity. And we know through some of the technologies that have been built, for example, some of the monitoring devices can give false readings based on the amount of melanin in your skin. And so we have to make sure we go through this rigor and testing so that we don't, again, perpetuate biases by using these technologies. And we have to make sure that the people that ultimately are affected by this have a voice in this process as well.
Well, thank you for that thorough answer, Christopher, and amen. I love the titles of your book, by the way, the health equity in particular. So my last question is, my second to last question is going to be a little bit of a twofer, and that is focused on how do we lead healthcare without losing the human element of care? And then most importantly, if we could change one thing about healthcare operates in America, what would it be and why haven't we done it yet? So Amy, I know I'm putting you on the hot seat a little bit, but how do we not lose the human element of what we're doing as we go through this? And what's the one thing you would change?
Leadership in this space, especially with AI, is going to require us to remember that the human element isn't something that we're trying to protect from transformation. It's what gives transformation its purpose. So leaders need to, first of all, communicate rigorously and relentlessly about why. Why are we transforming our system? And it's really about taking better care of each other. And so patient care has to be the continuously communicated North Star. The second is leaders have to be very clear. And as this space gets more complex, building lingua franca, a common way of talking across all of the different stakeholders, is progressively more important. And that's something I've seen across time in all the different swim lanes where I've worked. And I think this is the moment where it becomes particularly poignant. Last thing I'd say, which is something that I think is pretty interesting in this moment, is that we're starting to get more and more fragmentation of all the components of healthcare and healthcare delivery. In the 1990s and early 2000s, we were moving towards conglomerates and healthcare getting bigger and bigger, big companies, big health systems, big care delivery organizations. And now what we're seeing is smaller companies, fast actors, fast care delivery, and totally new models. And I think learning how to lead across different organizations of many different sizes, including the role of leading small organizations, is going to be a very important part of moving this whole space forward. I think they asked me to comment also on what I would change. I think we have to be able to ultimately move away from a scarcity mindset in healthcare.
I love it.
I need healthcare that works for me. And I need as much healthcare as I need to get to the place where I feel healthy. And I think all of us need that as people.
That's a great answer. Seema, how about you?
I'm excited about the future of where healthcare is going, but I'm going to go back to the fundamental. That interoperability piece is just so critical. Right? The data's got to be able to move. And once we accomplish that, I think we're going to be able to take the next step in healthcare. And I hope that we get back to a system where we're not afraid of AI, but we look at it as a tool that can actually enhance the doctor, patient, clinician, patient experience. I mean, part of what, in my view, part of the reason why we've lost trust in the system is because our doctors are doing this. They're staring at their keyboards and they're typing in stuff. We lost that eye-to-eye contact. We put providers in a position where they've got 10 minutes to see you, right? They've got to go through all of your chronic diseases and they got 10 to 15 minutes to do all of that, right? And I hope that the AI puts us in a new era where they do have more time, where they do have more tools, where the data around you is summarized. They know what you called in about. All of that stuff is right there and in front of them, and that we actually improve that experience and that we restore trust and we restore that doctor-patient relationship and that we bring people back to healthcare and to investing in their care, preventing disease, promoting quality of care, quality of life over the long term.
That's a great desire. Great parting thought. Christopher?
Yeah, and I know we're short on time, so I'll make my responses fairly quick. In terms of leadership, I think first and foremost, psychological safety. And what do I mean by that? You can't lead people through transformation if they're afraid. afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of looking stupid in front of the technology, afraid to tell you that something's not working well. And I think it's a leader's job, first and foremost, to create conditions that allow the users of this technology to be able to tell the truth about it, to tell their concerns about it, to make mistakes when they use it, and to learn without having the repercussions of being fired if things don't go quite well. I mean, we're asking clinicians to take on a tremendous amount of change right now in the area, the age of AI, along with continue to try to keep their jobs going, work long hours, deal with all this cognitive workload. They have their own health issues and family health issues they're dealing with. And we're asking them to make major changes. So I think psychological safety and letting them, we need you to be a part of this process. We're not trying to dump this on you. We want you to be a part of the change. We want you to be a change agent. And we're open to letting you learn and fail fast and provide, unfiltered commentary about the success or failure of the technologies that we're implementing. And then one thing I would change right now about the healthcare system, healthcare is extraordinarily expensive. It's extraordinarily a sophisticated, overly sophisticated process. And it's entirely focused on treating illnesses after they manifest. Meanwhile, the actual drivers of care are illness. We like food deserts, economic instability, environmental safety, education, trust are afterthought. And I do think that we have to build that into our narrative. The reality of it is we're in the middle of a silver tsunami that's taking place right now. And that is by 2030, we'll have more people over 60 than under 5 years of age. By 2050, 1/4 of the world's population is going to be over 65. We don't have enough people to take care of the aging population that is about to occur over the next two decades. We are going to have to rely on technology to be a part of this process to allow us to manage this large population of people who are going to have one or more comorbidity issues. And so we have to establish the guardrails we need to improve the efficacy and trust in these technologies. And we have to empower the people who are going to be a part of the care delivery process of the future to be able to learn these technologies, provide input about these technologies, fail fast on these technologies, and move on to the next thing so that we can deal with this tsunami that's ahead of us.
Well, it's a sobering thought to end on, and I do want to give each of you an opportunity real quickly. If people do want to follow you, engage you, your company, where do they go to do that? Like which platform? So Amy, quick thoughts on that front.
Easy to find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome.
And
I love it. And Christopher?
LinkedIn as well. And as you know, I have a podcast. It's called Straight Outta Health IT. Would love to have, your listeners listen in, and obviously have Amy and Seema become listeners as well, and maybe guests in the future too.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. And this is such a great conversation. I wish we could have gone another hour, but I know that you have very, very busy schedule. So thank you for staying for a few extra minutes. And with that, we'll wrap up.